everyone. My name is James Tralla, and welcome to the SANS webcast today on Security Standards Scorecard, the 2023 edition. Again, my name is James Tralla. I'm one of the SANS faculty members. I've been a senior instructor here at SANS for going on a little over 20 years and had the opportunity to work in a lot of research projects along with the one that we're going to be talking about today. So looking forward to taking the time to talk to everybody about some of the research we've been doing these last few years and sort of getting into some of those details. This webcast is the third in a series of webcasts that we've been delivering since about 2021. Prior to that, we did have some other sort of more informal ad hoc versions of this that we were putting out. But formally, starting in 2021, we started running an annual webcast every fall, every September, just like we're doing today, where we talk a little bit about cybersecurity standards, frameworks. Certainly, we're going to be talking, sort of hinting at the idea of regulation, law, kind of what's out there in the industry. And the hope is that we can use this as an opportunity to talk about trends that we're seeing, changes that we're seeing, give people an opportunity to learn a little bit about the updates that are taking place this year, what you should be paying attention to, sort of a news brief and a rating system all at once. One of the things is we definitely made some changes this year to the approach. There are some similarities. So those of you who have been sort of a follow of this the last couple of years, you'll see that there are definitely some similarities in our approach. But we took some time to sort of adjust a little bit, and we'll talk about those changes as we dive into this. One more practical thing I would say, though, for those of you who are listening live, I would say is if you do have any questions, please take the time to go ahead and put those into the Q&A section of Zoom. We probably won't get to too many of those during the presentation. Just keeping track of that sometimes can be distracting. But as we get through the end, I'll try to leave a little bit of time at the end of the presentation to address those. If we do run out of time for those questions, you do see my email address there on the screen. I would say for any question that you don't get answered or anything you want more clarity on, that is my real email address. I'm always happy to respond to questions as they come in. Want to make sure that you guys get the information you need to be successful with this. So that being said, let's go ahead and dive in here today. So the thing that I would start with is our problem statement, or the why statement that led us to start doing this webcast every year. The first thing that we determined, and many of you know, and many of you have seen this for years, is that there's literally dozens, if not hundreds, of cybersecurity standards that exist today. And I know when I first started my career in cybersecurity back in the late 90s and early 2000s, one of the very first regulations we were dealing with was the HIPAA regulations that were coming out for healthcare. And shortly thereafter, in 2002, we felt like there were a lot coming out because some of the things like Sarbanes-Oxley came out that year, GLBA had been released, and there was a couple others that BISMA in 2002 had come out. And so we thought with these 4 or 5 regulations that were out, that was kind of a big deal. There was a lot to try to parse and manage. Well, now today, literally, like I've said, there are in the hundreds of these cybersecurity standards that exist around the world, and it's only growing. It feels like every year there's just more and more of these that are on our plate. And I heard a statement a few years ago from a speaker. I was at a conference and listening, and the speaker at the cybersecurity conference said, listen, cybersecurity standards are pretty much all the same. It doesn't really matter which one you pick. Just pick one, just go with it. Just make sure you're putting some good defenses in place. And I heard that, and that really struck me. And to the point where I had to start looking at that a little bit more and understand, okay, how true is this? My gut tells me this is a very, very wrong statement, but I don't have any data to really back that up. And so I wanted to take the time to really investigate that a little bit more. And since then, I've actually had an opportunity to speak with that speaker at that conference and go through the data with them. And we've all basically agreed that this really couldn't be further from the truth. These standards are not the same. They're very different. And what we're finding more and more is now that there's even categories of standards. And we're talking about that a little bit today. And so there tends to be this thing within organizations that I'm seeing. If I look at my clients or talk to students or just people in the industry, is there tends to be this almost religious adherence to a standard or standards body. So for instance, lots of organizations follow NIST. So one of the various NIST standards that exist. A lot of people will go out and follow ISO places. Some people will follow Center for Internet Security, or there's again just a lot of other things like this that are out there. And we'll be looking at some of these as we go through today. but they tend to be based on things like popularity, or commonly, especially at the executive level, what I'm seeing is organizations will take a standard and bring a standard with them from company to company because they're comfortable with that standard. So, for instance, I was working with one organization in the Midwest, and they had been sort of a diehard Center for Security shop for a lot of years. And all of a sudden, a new board member came in who was very NIST cybersecurity framework focused. And of course, everything changes. Right now, of course, the focus on on the CSF, project management, control, safeguard selection, all tweaks, all moves based on the preferences of the new board member. So it's very common that as I work with organizations, I don't see any sort of methodology in place or any formal process in place to decide what standard or standards, plural, sort of makes sense for an organization. So that's what we want to sort of talk about today is how do we, in light of the fact that there are these hundreds of standards, what do we do and how do we make these decisions? So again, the goal for this particular webcast is to be an annual study that we do. Every year, we're going to take a slightly different track. We don't want to just repeat the same information year after year. We want to sort of look at where the changes that are taking place, maybe look at things from a slightly different way, communicate what we've learned from folks in the industry, what's there. We will definitely always look at some of the more popular cybersecurity standards, and we do have a grading format, sort of a benchmarking process that we use for these. We're pretty transparent, you'll see as we get into the webcast, to show some of the criteria, almost like a threat model would be, except more characteristics based, since obviously standards aren't threats per se. But we want to reconsider the evaluation criteria. We're taking feedback. One of the nice things is just because we've done this a few times now is students have been great. People who listen to the webcast giving us feedback say, hey, have you considered this? Which just adds to the body of knowledge and frankly just makes it better for everybody. So as you all have ideas, please send them along. The whole goal of these kind of efforts is just to be more of a community-based research project. So if you have ideas which we can improve, then every time you share with us, it improves the model. And every time the model improves, everybody benefits. So hopefully this is something that really just helps everybody out as we go through this. So we'll talk about a potential methodology for evaluating these standards. And certainly we know that different organizations are going to have different goals, and you're going to want to adjust accordingly to some of these. However, I'm also a very strong believer that organizations are not snowflakes. Most all of you have the same technology stacks. And what I mean by that is you have Windows workstations, maybe you have some Macs. You have Linux servers, maybe you have some Windows servers. You're using cloud storage providers, or I'm sorry, cloud service providers. So you're using Amazon, you're using Microsoft Azure, you're using Google. So there's, and I could talk boundary devices, you're using Palo Alto, Cisco, Fortinet. There's a tech stack that's common. And frankly, attackers don't care if you're a bank or a school or a hospital. They just don't care. They care the technologies behind the scenes. They care, do their tools work? They care, can they use their tools on your systems to achieve their goal, which, whether it be theft of information, theft of intellectual property, some sort of ransomware sort of way to make money. That's basically what we're talking about here. So again, we're going to assume that you may have different goals and you may want to tweak these models a little bit. But at the end of the day, I think most of you are going to find yourself in situations where you're going to follow a very similar approach. So hopefully this will give us a chance to talk about some intelligent decisions and how we can look at some of these criteria. So, we've looked at lots of different standards specifically for this version of the webcast. Last year, I think I was at maybe 40, 45 standards I was looking at. This year, we sort of developed a new methodology for the way that we were going to go ahead and parse these. So we actually ballooned a little bit up to just over 70 standards now that we specifically have looked at for this study alone. That number we expect to increase, even though I know that there are more than that in the world. That's just what I've had the time to parse. And so one of the things that we did this year was we developed a standardized parsing format for these standards to make it easier to do evaluations against each other. And you'll see that when it gets into the data section, we have to do some evaluation and do some quantitative analysis, sort of comparing these against each other. So we had to have a standardized way of doing that. But the nice thing is now that we have that, it's made it very, very easy to add new standards into that list. In fact, this week alone, I've had a request for about 10 new standards to be added into our database. So I'll make that sort of a general rule too. If you have a standard that you really want to make sure is in our database, certainly the big ones like you can see on the screen there are there, and we're more than happy to take requests though. So if you do have requests for other standards, please forward them along. We're always happy to look at those with you, add those to the database. It just, again, it's become part of our standard process during the year. Obviously, some of the new ones that you'll see on this list from last year, we did go ahead and evaluate the cybersecurity framework in this CSF version 2 draft. And it's funny because normally my policy has been don't evaluate drafts because oftentimes they change. You put a lot of work, a lot of effort into it. We sort of teach one way, and then people get confused when they're trying to get resources. Are they listening to a draft presentation or one of the finalized presentations down the road? So my policy has been generally don't do drafts, but this one has gotten so much attention. I felt like we had to spend some time on that. Of course, we've looked at CMMC sort of in the new version 2 format, sort of looking at that in light of the DFARS 800-171 and 800-172. So all those, of course, are now considered as well. The 27002 2022 standard had come out last year prior to the webcast. So that is sort of the same sort of year by year there. And you'll see, we'll talk a little bit about HIPAA, COBIT, Defend, and some of those. But you'll see, again, they're going to be a little bit more minimized in this year's study. You'll understand why. Okay, so some changes for this year. So what are some of the changes that we did as we went through this process? One of the biggest things that we started to think about this year is that in previous years, we had been evaluating cybersecurity standards sort of holistically, or basically everybody against the same benchmark. And what I started to realize was, I think it's important for us to understand differences that exist, but I don't know if it's fair that we evaluate a standard who says our scope is to do X and then evaluate them against scope Y. It just started to get me thinking that way, that maybe we're being unfair in the way that we approach those standards. And so I think what we're going to do is we're going to continue to publish data about differences. And that way you can understand, okay, is this a governance model? Is this a hygiene model? Is this meant to be a comprehensive model? But the ones we're really going to compare against our baseline standard are going to be those that make claims to be all inclusive. And so if you come out as a standards body and say, you know what, all we want to do is put out a hygiene standard. We want to give you a top 10 list and we're going to call it a day. Well, then we all know that that's who you are. And we're not going to try to evaluate you against every possible control or safeguard that might be out there. However, if you come out, if you're one of the big ones and you come out and you say, listen, we're say like the CSF, and we believe we're going to be sort of all inclusive, well, then that's fine. But then that's going to be somebody we're going to compare against the bigger standard. Because when people are showing themselves to be scoped as sort of comprehensive in scope, then we want to call out what they're doing well, where there could be improvement. And that way, if you do find yourself in a situation where you need to add additional controls or safeguards into your environment, you need to be able to know where those are. So we are going to do more categorization this year. That's going to be something that we spend some time with. We'll spend some time talking about that here in a second. And then only those, what we're going to call it, and you see my air quotes there, my comprehensive standards. Basically, it's going to be organizations or standards bodies who say, we believe the standard is a pretty decent comprehensive approach to cybersecurity. Now, I understand that a lot of them don't actually say that, right? But however, the way the marketing is done, the way that it's encouraged when it comes across that way, then we're going to call them quote unquote comprehensive and evaluate them against that. So that, and again, you'll see those. We're going to have graphs on those here in just a second. The other thing we're going to have in here too is we're going to recognize that some of these standards are rising and others are falling in popularity. And I'm certainly not a financial advisor. Don't take stock advice from me, right? But I can tell you, if I look through the lens of almost that, so a stock price going up or down and looking at standards, there are definitely standards in the last few years that are gaining popularity and standards that are losing popularity. Now, just because a standard might be losing popularity for a given period of time doesn't mean they're not going to rebound. For instance, I give the folks at ISO a lot of credit because I feel like when they released their 2013 version, they got a lot of attention for a little bit. But as that standard got older, remember, there's a 9-year gap between 2013 and 2022's version. So as that, again, as time went on, further they got from their release, there's this general sense what happens is the longer and standards body waits to release a standard, the less popularity it has. It tends to go down a bit. But kudos again to the ISO folks because when they released their 2022 version, it almost instantly popped back up in popularity. So that does happen. But we'll talk about that as we're going through and recognize that this is happening as it changes which of these standards we spend more of our time on. So one of the first things I want to do is just talk about these categories that I mentioned a little bit ago. So what we're finding is that standards are starting to fit into different types of categories. And in the old days, maybe 2, 3 years ago, I think I had the mindset that there was maybe one standard that was trying to be comprehensive. And that, of course, would have been NIST's 853 special publication. And that one, literally, Dr. Ross and everyone who's working on that team said, the goal was to create a document that says, here are all the possible things we could do to defend ourselves. And it shows, right? If you look at that guide, that is very detailed, is very big. You're talking thousands of safeguards that are in that book. And that would be sort of one version. On the other hand, I would say that there are more issue-specific standards that you have out there that you're dealing with. And I'm thinking hygiene guides, governance guides, things that are a little bit more targeted at a particular problem that they're trying to solve. And then on top of that, I would always say that there's sort of this in the middle group, which is what I would call more the, choosing from the cybersecurity buffet. And probably a lot of you have heard me use that phrase before, because it seems like people sort of pick the safeguards that they're popular to them, the things that they like for whatever reason, whatever their scope happens to be. And so they would go ahead and choose those and drop them into a standard. And I think this is probably, I don't say it's a lazy way of defining these, but I think there could have been a more nuanced approach. And so that's what we tried to do this year, is look at some of those more nuanced sides of things. So one of the first categories that I'll bring up right away are what I'll call these cyber hygiene standards. And these tend to be released by governments. It's not that they're only government agencies that are here, but for the most part, the ones that we see on this list, it's funny, it's not only are they government agencies, most of them are Five Eyes, or sort of that alliance of Five Eyes countries working together. They tend to follow the same theories. And so, with the exception maybe being the French, who also have a standard on this list. But if we look at the list, you'll see, for example, we have the Australian government with the ACSC, their Essential 8. In fact, I would still say, just for those of you looking for a solid hygiene standard, that's been around since 2009 and just continues to be a very solid piece of research. So if you've not, again, taken time to look at that, ACSC Essential 8, that is sort of my go-to right now for organizations looking for hygiene standards. They've been building on it every year. It is data-driven. In fact, I might argue, of all the cybersecurity standards that exist in the world, this may be the only cybersecurity standard that is literally data-driven, which always excites me about that project. There are others here on this list, though. The US NSA has a couple. The NSA Top 10 guide has always been popular. There's a few versions of that out there. Their management network plan is sort of less popular, sort of an earlier version of the Top 10, but always sort of works its way onto this list. The French and their ANSSI standard, they do have it's been a couple years since they've released one, but again, you can see theirs. The Canadians have a top 10, the British have a top 10. One could argue that the CDM, the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program out of Homeland Security, although again, getting a little older now, that might fit into this category. But the thing about these standards is these are designed to say, what are those core things that we can do to potentially defend ourselves? What are those things we absolutely need to do? I remember sitting in Dubai with Jane Liu, who was CEO at the Center for Internet Security at the time. And we were having a nice dinner there in Dubai. And just talking, she said, James, we need to be able to, there's this need in the community that we need to be able to communicate what is hygiene. She said, when she was in the Army and she was signals intelligence, she said, there's some of this I understand, but she said, I don't understand some of the daily things that actually stop these attacks, but we need to be able to communicate that to people. She said, but I know when I talk to my dentist, she'd always tell me, she said, my dentist would tell me if I don't want to lose my teeth, brush my teeth, floss, and have regular dental checkups. And that will help ensure that I, well, frankly, don't lose your teeth. And she said, James, what are the things we need to do to make sure that we're going to give people good hygiene advice on the cyber side, just like my dentist gives us hygiene advice on the dental side? And so that's what these guides tend to be. So I wouldn't want to run these through the same criteria. So I sort of pulled them out to the side. Maybe in future studies, what we'll do is we'll do sort of a separate criteria for each of these groups. We did not do that this year just for the sake of making it a little easier to read, but it might be one of those things over the years that we sort of change our evaluation methodology. We're sort of always evaluating how we're going to do that. The comprehensive list, these are the people we're going to spend a little more time on today. You can see the CSF, of course, is going to be on that list, although we're not going to run the version 2 through our standard. I can maybe talk to you about some of the high-level changes you all will see there. The ISO standards, things coming out in CMMC, 80171 sort of under that umbrella. The CIS controls, just looking at version 8 now going forward. PCI DSS, I sort of debated putting that one on this list, but it still feels like it's broad enough where it's trying to do this all comprehensive side. And of course, as many the collector control catalog is something near and dear to my heart that we'll put on that list as well. Some other ones that I'll put on this list, we have what I'll call the cybersecurity buffet standards. Again, I've used this word quite a few times on previous webcasts, but the idea of this is to say, these are folks that are looking at sort of the breadth of cybersecurity defenses and saying things that are important to us are these safeguards. And therefore, we're going to focus on those safeguards and release a standard that's sort of along those lines. And you might say, James, well, what's the difference between one of these comprehensive safeguard lists and the cybersecurity buffet standards? The buffet standards to me seem to be a little more, well, frankly, they're smaller. We'll say it that way. They tend to be often released faster, and there's maybe a little more what I'll call randomness or bias that goes into safeguard selection. And there's always sort of an idea behind it. It's not good or bad, right? It just means that that's what it was. So for example, if you look at the Cloud Security Alliance and their cloud control matrix, for example, again, it's not to say that it's a bad standard by any means. It's just they're very targeted in a particular scope that has to do with cloud. Or if we're looking at IRS Pub 1075, the FCA examination manual, even we could look at the FFIEC's CAT tool. I guess I could have put that on the list here too. Even the Canadian OSFI, right? These are very focused on financial services and sort of helping folks sort of in that space look at a set of controls that they've deemed appropriate. Same with NYDFS. I know there's a new version of that coming out. We're in draft format already. But NYDFS also sort of has that sort of picking from the buffet kind of idea. The other ones that we'll look at here then, sort of the last category I have are then what I'll call my governance standards. And last year, a lot of you might remember that we went ahead and put these into our standards, into our graphs to show just the focuses that are there. But again, they were actually one of the reasons why I think I pulled and started doing these categories as opposed to just graphing everybody, because what I was finding is that these standards especially are very, very heavy on the governance side, which is great. Like we need governance guides to help us understand how to do program management. But when we look at these are going to be very, very skewed towards the idea of putting good program management in place, but they're not concerned so much with are you using multi-factor or how fast do you patch your systems. The other one, as I'm just sort of looking here at the slide thinking, we probably should have added to the slide would have been 27001 from the ISO group. That also probably would have been appropriate to add to this list. A lot of times we look at 27001 and 27002 together, but really we should separate these. 27002 really should be back on that comprehensive list, and 27001 really should be here. But I do call out specifically the AICPA's trusted service criteria here, or TSC. It is yes, a little bit older, going on about 6 years now, definitely more of a governance standard, as many of you know. So it's going to fall outside of our charts and such that we have here in the presentation. But I will say this standard is getting a lot of attention along with the ISO standard because of its potential ability to help organizations with their third-party management. In other words, so if I go to you and say, hey, are you following good security best practices? A lot of organizations want to be able to just hand over an ISO report or hand over a SOC 2 Type 2, for instance, based on the AICPA standards there, and use that as sort of an easy button for third-party compliance. So there's been, again, I think sort of not a resurgence, but there's been a really steady increase in what they're doing on the AICPA side as well, the popularity that's there. So what I want to do then is I want to look at, so there are these categories for sure, but let's look at criteria that we could use across any of these should we choose to. And part of why I'm doing this is I don't want to just feed you information, but I want you to start thinking about how you would evaluate a standard as you are making a decision which of these standards you want to implement. And so I've got my criteria list here on the screen. And so in the presentation, what I'm going to show you is that we've used this criteria to evaluate what I'm calling those comprehensive standards. Just because, again, just to be fair, I only put them into scope this year for what we're going to evaluate. But you could very easily follow some of these principles or these characteristics and apply these, say, against a hygiene standard. So maybe you say to yourself, you know what I want to do is I want to look at the hygiene standards, use this to compare against the hygiene standards, and use it to help me to decide which of these hygiene standards make the most sense to me. Or maybe in that category, you'd say, you know what, I'm just going to map all the hygiene standards against each other and see what they all say, and maybe make one aggregate list of just the hygiene safeguards based on what these intelligence agencies are saying. Or maybe I would do the same with the governance standards, is maybe I could do a rating against those. And sort of there's two approaches there, right? We could do the rating using criteria like this, or you can map them against each other, create an aggregate standard, kind of compare, get some ideas from everybody. In other words, almost like treat these like checklists, right? And then just take the best of all the lists. Again, create your own cybersecurity buffet standard that's there. But again, you can see some of those criteria that were used. And what we did was we did assign letter grades. So for those of you in the US, of course, this will make a lot of sense as people go through school and get these grades or marks as they go through school. But those of you outside the US, this might not always be the case. So what we did was the letters A, B, C, D, and F. Just again, in schools in the US, that's what people are using. And then what we did was we assigned numeric values to each of those. It made it easy, first of all, just to give the grade, which was a little subjective in nature, as you can imagine. But then it turns that subjective rating into a more quantitative number. I would argue maybe not completely objective, right? And we'll just be honest with everybody, is that you can take these subjective grades and feed subjective grades into a numeric platform and create quantitative results. But just because we have quantitative results doesn't necessarily mean that we have objective results. So just take this with a grain of salt. There are some pieces of this data that are going to be very objective, right? If I look at Google Trends, if I look at some of the things that are going on, let's say by percentages of completion of an area of safeguards, these are all things that I can definitely quantify and maybe be a little more objective about. There's other things like, for example, the age of a standard, which we've become more objective about. So what we did was we created sort of a range where, depending on what year the latest release of a standard was, is we said, okay, you're going to get this letter grade based on this year. So things like that. It turns out you can actually have a relatively objective, quantifiable score. But other things become a little bit more squishy. And so we tried to use objective scoring wherever we possibly could, just recognizing, of course, that in some cases, there's some subjectiveness that goes into this, some grades that we had to give based on feeling, right? So again, I'm not going to read this list to you. This list is relatively consistent with last year. A couple tiny tweaks, nothing really significant though, for the most part. None of these, and I should also say too, we did not do any weighting with these scores. That's something we still debate. We went around and around about that this year, making certain things higher priority. For example, knowing that cybersecurity threats change on a regular basis, we thought to ourselves, well, should we go ahead and prioritize age of a standard, maybe over some of these others, just knowing that it's fresh and up to date? But at least at this point, we decided not to, although certainly we are going to show our work. So if you want to go ahead and prioritize any of these, you can take this data. All of this will be presented after the fact. You can grab this offline, so you don't have to take screenshots or something. But you could go in there and look at the presentation later and adjust our scores however you see fit. Okay, so those are going to be some of the things that we're going to go ahead and look at there for the standards themselves. The baseline that we used is the same baseline that we've used in previous years, which is what's called the Collective Control Catalog. This is the aggregate safeguard library that we created at the beginning of the pandemic. And based on the current database size that we have, we've basically taken the 70 plus standards, cybersecurity standards that we've evaluated so far at a detailed level. And what we've done is we've said, okay, well, what would we have to do to go ahead and be compliant with all of those standards and every requirement from all of those standards? And we came up with an aggregate list of statements that you would need to do in order to meet all those goals. And so it comes to about 412 statements. Those 412 statements then can be compared against these other standards, and that sort of became the baseline for this. So sort of, if we looked at a Venn diagram, right, and you have all these tiny circles of standards, and then all those tiny circles sort of overlap a little bit, but form a much larger circle when viewed in aggregate. the collective controls catalog really is that sort of large aggregate model that's there. That's the same group that created the collective governance and risk model, the collective threat taxonomy, which used to be the open threat taxonomy. This is an open source project. We were trying to give away a lot of this data just to put it in people's hands. We've got groups like SANS, Enclave Security, Institute of Applied Network Security, Black Hills Information Security, just a lot of groups, Cisco Umbrella, a bunch of groups sort of participated and have been getting, Red Canaries getting involved, just groups like this sort of help give us a good perspective to make sure that we're on the right track with this. The other things that are involved in this, of course, we have some other aspects like categorizations, tagging, safeguard prioritizations, things like that included in that. But again, that sort of becomes the baseline. So as we're evaluating how many, let's say, governance safeguards are in the standard, we're going to use the governance safeguards from the collective controls catalog as the baseline to compare against that so we can see what deltas might be in place. So that being said, so let's sort of talk about some of these. Some of this data is going to be similar, things you've seen in the past. We tried to use some of the same formatting, same presentation styles here to make it easy for us to understand this. But we have the NIST cybersecurity framework. We'll look at sort of a few of these at a time. We'll go through these just a little bit faster here. But first of all, what you can see the methodology that we use. And so first of all, what we did is we looked at these different categories of safeguards that might be in place. And so we've got these 12 categories. The 12 categories then are further broken down by instrumentation or technical platform that we would use to go ahead and implement these controls. That's not in the graph, but it's in some of the downloads where we grab the standards online. And so what we did was, if you sort of look at each of these graphs, you'll see that there's a far right line, gray, kind of hard to read maybe on the slide, but that's our 100% line. And basically the question is, which of the statements from that aggregate model, or those 412 statements that comes from the 70 plus standards, what percent of those controls or safeguards are included in the CSF? So if the mirror is the aggregate library, and we look at the CSF in light of that aggregate library, how did it do? Where is it excelling? Where are things that could be better? And what you'll see is the CSF is obviously very good, very focused and targeted on what we'll call more operational controls. But then if you look sort of around some of the other things, you'll see that there's sort of almost a buffet approach, right? So it's clearly trying to address all of the areas, all of the topic areas in cybersecurity, but it's not necessarily going into a ton of depth about any of those. Or sometimes what this is sort of reminiscent of is what they'll do is they'll talk very broadly, like thou shalt have a access management program, for instance, but it might not get into the details for what that means. And so very common what these standards will say is that, hey, we expect you to figure out the details, which is, not good or bad. We're not trying to pass judgment on it. But when the bars are lower, like you'll see on some of these, it either means that they're not talking about particular topics, which I'll give you an example. Patch management, it turns out, is something that some of these standards, actually quite a few of the standards, just don't speak to. It's just quiet to that. They might have something broad in terms of like workstation protection or something like or endpoint protection, but they don't exactly say what that means. So in my opinion, if you don't specifically call out patch management and you say, well, it's under the umbrella of something else, that's fine, you can do that, but you're not going to get credit for covering that topic in the evaluation. And so that's how this works. So when you see these smaller lines, it doesn't mean bad, but what it might indicate, looking at these, is that there's a vagueness or they're leaving the technical details up to you to figure that out, or maybe they're just not addressing topics. And that's sort of a combination of what you're probably seeing here. Now, the question also what might come up here, well, what about the new version 2? Is that covering different controls, different safeguards? For the most part, no. Many of you have probably seen the new draft and seen that there's a governance section. Everybody seems to love the NIST CSF wheel diagram. If you've not seen that, Google it. They've definitely added governance as part of that wheel, which I think is great. I think that's absolutely what they should do. I love what they've done there. In fact, I think that wheel is probably one of the very best things that's come out of the CSF diagram, talking to us about categories of safeguards. Love it. But that being said, for the most part, what they did in version 2, and I know I'm one of those weirdos that kind of looks at this on a line by line basis, They mostly move the safeguards around as opposed to adding new or removing. A couple removed, a couple were added, but I give them a lot of credit because one of the statements they've added seems to indicate, they didn't actually come out and say it, but it seems to be they're finally adding the idea of application control or limiting the execution of unauthorized binaries into the standard, which again, if you've heard any of my webcasts know, that's probably one of my favorite safeguards that we can put in place. Again, I credit the Australians for a lot of good research on that one. So for the most part, you're going to see the 2.0 draft very, very similar to this graph that's here, maybe a couple tiny little adjustments along the way. And next year's report will probably look a little bit different, but honestly, it's going to look pretty similar. The 1.0, the 1.1, the 2.0, if we're just being honest, there weren't that many changes between those three versions, very, very minor along the way. Google trending, and interestingly enough, I would say, with interest over time, I think what you're seeing there, it's not a huge uptick, but I would say looking at just trending from the Google side of things, I actually do believe this is pretty accurate, that you're seeing just a slight uptick in discussions about the CSF. More interestingly enough, although the cybersecurity framework was created specifically for critical infrastructure organizations, and more the TSA guidelines are being applied to critical infrastructure and the CSF is not as much, it's actually interesting to see the CSF is being adopted by non-critical system, non-government or private sector entities, probably more than anything else. So even though it was scoped for X, it's actually being adopted by Y. So just kind of a curiosity as I look at that. And for the most part, again, you're going to see the grades have changed a little bit, not a lot, I don't think. A couple things just went down a little here just because of age. I know everyone always looks at my scores and sort of thinks, boy, James, you are a really, really hard grader, which is true. Because I want to give us opportunities to improve and think about how things could be sort of included or maybe improved a little bit over time. You're going to see a definite range for sure. And it's not to say that I think these are bad, and I don't want to give that impression to anybody. But what I want us to do is see where there are opportunities we could improve and be better as an industry. And that's what I'm hoping you see here. A couple of these you're going to see that everybody scores bad on. Almost everybody scores bad on privacy. In fact, I've even debated making that a category and just taking that off of my evaluation because no one's really addressing privacy in these standards. You have to go to dedicated privacy standards for that. Also, mapping threats to controls. Really, nobody is doing that. There's one project I'm aware that's going to do some releases next year. As I talk with people who are going to do a little more, I'm sorry, two that are going to do that. So you might see that change next year, but that's sort of a work in progress still. And then as far as mapping it to specifically addressing some of the more modern threats, by modern threats, I mean things that have really sort of popularized in the last few years. That tends to be a struggle for a lot of organizations. The other one I'll say too, that everyone's going to score bad on, you're going to see this pretty much for all of these, is going to be prioritization. I know there's profiles in the CSF, but as far as actually doing prioritization of safeguards, that's something I feel like there's definitely, we could probably do some improvement on. And that's sort of across the board. Also, again, we'll see here on the ISO side, again, we're not going to spend a ton of time on each of these. I'll sort of give you some high level things to look at and move on. One of the things I want to give ISO credit for just immediately, they always score some of the best in software development. I feel like they have sort of this application software business development mindset that goes into the ISO standard. I think it just comes from its initial roots over at Shell Oil and sort of the philosophies that they had. But I give them credit. If you're looking for some of the most specific guidance on software development, or at least broad strokes on software development, this does tend to be one of the better ones that I'd be looking at. You'll notice again, operations also scores high, not quite as high as CSF, but you can see some trending there. But it's interesting to me because there's a lot of overlap in the graphs designs. If I compare 27,002 with what I'm seeing over at the CSF, a lot of really doing well on operations. Identity and access management is always a topic that standards like this tend to focus on, but I give ISO a little bit of credit on software development. And if I just go back a couple slides so you can compare, again, you'll see sort of more of a baseline across these, where system monitoring and governance are a little bit more focused here. But again, you can see this on the ISO side, the software development sort of wins out a little bit. So again, just sort of seeing where those controls actually exist and looking at these. I think about ISO, I'd say, is the past 5 years, you've got a lot of just consistency in this one. I don't know that there's been a huge uptick, although I will say anecdotally from clients I talk to, especially people doing third-party management, as I mentioned, there does seem to be more of an increase in the ISO space. But again, looking at Google and some of that, trying to be more objective about it, it seems just very steady state, which is not bad at all, right? It could be going down. But I think it's sort of a good blue chip. I think both of these are sort of blue chip standards as we see these. And again, you can see some of our scores there. Again, sort of same challenges we're seeing with a lot of the standards, things like privacy controls being an issue, threat mapping modeling, of course, being an issue. Doing prioritization becomes an issue. And sort of, again, one of the things I'll give them credit for is just the fact that they have released a new version, in the last 24 months. So one of the few that's actually released an update here recently. So give them some credit for that. So that pumped up their score just a little bit there. One of the ones that I would definitely be paying more attention to, just looking at just overall what sort of has caught my attention this year. I'm going to put CMMC into this conversation. I feel like as I look at, and again, when I say CMMC, again, let me just clarify. What I'm really talking about, of course, is a combination of the acquisition requirements, the DFARS. I'm thinking about, which are sort of a baseline of a small number of basic hygiene controls almost. The NIST Special Publication 800-171 and the NIST Special Publication 800-172, which is a little bit newer as of last year. I think when we look at those in aggregate, so sort of thinking this like a level 3 kind of a thing, definitely you see a bit more coverage as far as controls. And you can just see from the graph right away, especially on the technical side, it really seems to be where they're excelling. And if I were looking at this again like a stock analyst and looking at for potential upside on a standard, what they're doing with 800-171 and 172 really sort of excites me, because I feel like what I'm seeing is they're addressing those common hygiene controls, they're addressing the common compliance controls, and they're also trying to add some things in there that are addressing modern issues they're detecting. Doesn't mean I always agree with it, but I feel like they're really trying. So for example, doing attacker emulation and things like that, they're one of the only standards to call those kinds of things out, which are, again, what I'll consider more modern responses to the threats that we're seeing. So again, and you can just see just clearly in the graph that they have more coverage in what they're trying to address. And I feel like they were trying to be more specific in their standards, more to the point, less debate about what the controls meant. Sometimes you may not always agree with them. For example, people might say, well, wait, why is there a statement about voice over IP? Why is there something so specific in the standard? Well, because it's important. And that is something we need to think about as we're developing our control standards. So it's a double-edged sword, right? People will be more likely to debate a standard that's more specific, but a more specific standard makes it easier to understand the guidance that's actually being promoted. So is this a governance standard? No, I don't know that this is really excelling in the area of governance, but if you look at some of these other areas, they're doing a very good job in some of the other categories that are there. So again, if you've not looked at 171 and 172, I would be putting that on my radar for sure. And obviously in the last 5 years, you've seen a huge uptick percentage-wise as far as where that standard's going. Now, I understand we can debate, is the Department of Defense going to actually require this? And I know people have very strong opinions about this, but I think regardless of the regulatory environment of this, I think it's worthwhile for us to be paying attention to the statements themselves. It seems like they're going in an interesting direction for sure. Again, we can see our grades, and even again, I kind of wish that they would score in the Bs. I was kind of hoping that they'd get a little bit higher. What may happen if I pull privacy out and such for next year's scores, I wouldn't be surprised if that happens at all. So keep an eye on this one. I think this is one that I would definitely be paying attention to. And that's sort of, again, we'll just call it CMMC, but 800, 171, 172, all of that sort of together. And then you can see if I separated just 171, the scores are a little bit different, right? There's some extra things when we start looking at what's in 172 and some of those others that are there. And again, people seem more interested in the CMMC topic area. I think that this might be a Google search issue, but you can see a slight uptick on the 171 searches. But my guess here is that also the CMMC 171 overlap is definitely going to be there, sort of looking at the two of those together. Obviously, one near and dear to my heart, Center for Security or CIS Controls. So this is looking at version 8. Interestingly enough, a lot of overlap sort of from a graph perspective on the technical side of this control framework, as what we saw with some of the requirements of 171 and CMMC. Interestingly enough, I think there was actually a pretty strong influence on the folks who created the 171 standard and who created 172. I feel like they definitely took the time to reference the Center for Security CIS controls when they were doing some of that. In fact, if you read some of the 171 statements, especially if you look at some of the original version versus some of the later versions and see some of the deltas, you can see some of the statements in there that clearly were taken almost directly from the CIS controls. So obviously this is a project that I was a part of for a lot of years. Sort of like I always like to see where they're going. A couple things about this one. Many of you probably remember from reading about this or studying this that the scope of the CIS controls was always specifically to say that these would not be governance statements. In fact, so one of the original creators of this project was, of course, Alan Poller, who was the founder of the SANS Institute and founder of Center for Internet Security. And so Alan had made it very, very clear in his vision for this document that this was not meant to be just yet another compliance standard. He always wanted the standard to be something that was going to be focused on technical controls, that something was going to be focused on automation, and was not going to focus on some of the more governance or paperwork exercises. He was very, very adamant about that in all the initial meetings we had about this document. And so, as you can see, certainly over time with any standard, there's going to be scope creep, and you can see a lot. There's probably more governance controls that has creeped in with version 8 than any version I've seen to date. But still, you can see prioritized more as a technical standard for sure when compared to some of the other standards. Very, very similar to what you're seeing on the 800-171 and CMMC side of things. So again, you can see those there. Again, privacy, not really focused, not really in scope. So again, that's a debate. We can sort of talk about whether that's appropriate here or not. Again, all of these standards sort of have fared the same way when it comes to that. But again, if we look at version 8 of the controls here and go back to our chart for CMMC, and you see a lot of standardization, right? Little tweaks here or there. Maybe monitoring is better here. When I look over here at monitoring, maybe it's not quite as high, but I think in general, though, you can see, again, a lot of similarities and sort of the trending that's there. Sorry. Graph there. Some of the trending that's there. I will say that one of the things I do appreciate about the CIS controls here too is that they do tend to focus more on network device protection. I remember being in a few meetings when I was volunteering at Center for Internet Security, the various government agencies, and I won't say who, but had sort of encouraged CIS to minimize these statements and maybe even remove entire sections of network defenses. But I appreciate that they've left them in. I think this will be a trend we'll have to watch because I feel like, especially with this trend of organizations, having people work from home or making on-campus networks more just internet service provider kind of networks, I feel like the controls that will be necessary in the space might start to be minimized. So I feel like that's something we're going to have to watch. But a lot of the other standards don't even address that topic. And if you go back and look through the slides later and you look at that score, you'll see that score tends to be low for almost all of these standards. So the CSF is notorious for not addressing network devices. So I appreciate that they're still mentioning those here at Center for Internet Security. I hope to see that trend continue. I know certainly from version 7 to version 8, there's not as many controls in that space, but at least they've left it on the radar. So I definitely like that aspect. So I'm trying to call out some of just these details that I like there. Also, clearly on the software development side, along with ISO, I feel like they've done a good job here. And they've clearly rewritten that section near the end of the document to talk about some specific recommendations when it comes to software development. So there's not a lot of good software guidance out there today. There's a huge gap in the industry as far as actually detailed guidance. Obviously groups like Microsoft and OWASP and others have some docs that are available, but as far as actually putting them into a standard stock like this, it's definitely something that's sort of a work in progress across our industry. And again, you can see some stability here. Probably CIS controls are still probably not quite as popular as maybe, say, an ISO or something like that, with maybe a little bit more track record there. But having said that, I spent a little bit more time in Europe this year talking about the CIS controls. I do know they're actually getting more international popularity, especially in Europe. And so it'll be interesting to see how ISO sort of relates with this in the coming years now that they have a new version out. But traditionally, the CIS controls were very popular in the US. The Australians have their own standards. They've sort of been an island, no pun intended there, of doing their own standard. But Europe, it seems, is starting to get on the bandwagon of the CIS controls. And I've noticed this especially in Germany and in the Nordic states. That tends to be true. Germany a little bit more. It'll be interesting to see how the EU's new NIS2 standards, how that starts to influence the European popularity of some of these statements that are there. So again, I would say this probably still scores one of the better ones that we have there. Again, some of the same standard challenges, right? Threat mappings are still going to be an issue for pretty much all the standards. Privacies, measures guides, still things that we don't always have those in place. So hopefully those will sort of boost these scores here in the future years. I left PCI 4 in here just as just one other quick one, just to kind of give you just perspective. The one difference I'd say with this versus a lot of the others we've seen so far is that PCI is designed to be a compliance standard. It's not meant to be something you're 75% compliant with, right? So if I look at the CIS controls, for instance, or look at the CSF, there's very rarely is there an organization, in fact, by very rarely, I mean, literally, I've never met an organization that's doing everything. So if you were to try to certify yourself against, say, the CSF or 800-171 even, you're not going to see a lot of organizations that really meet that. Like you're not going to see, like if I was to go and do an audit, like I would never audit someone and give them a certification saying, hey, you've implemented all the CIS controls. Or even I know many of you know about the implementation groups in the CIS controls. Like I've never met an organization that I could certify on implementation group 1 even. So that's just not the nature of that standard. So again, being able to say, hey, anyone is doing all those things, I've never met that company. So PCI though is a little different, right? PCI is designed to say, no, we actually want you to be compliant. And so the more you have legislative models for compliance, the lower the bar has to be, right? Because the bar has to be achievable. And that's kind of the nature of what we're seeing here with PCI is you're seeing the bars are literally a little bit lower. But part of that is because, frankly, that they want to make sure that the bar is achievable. Otherwise, how do you certify someone on something if the bar is not achievable? So it's just a little different mindset. And I think that might be something in future years I've been keeping my eye on. I almost put it in this year's report where we said we were going to go ahead and do a legislative category. And I'm still debating that one. Next year, I might go ahead and add it, but things that are more legislatively focused. And I understand PCI is not legislation, it's contractual, but it still has that compliance mindset. So I'll have to come up with a good name for that, but that's something that's been on the back of my mind as well. Again, pretty steady state. I don't know that that's really changed a whole lot in the last couple of years. Maybe with the release of 4, you see a spike. I'm not sure if that's where that correlation is on the graph on the right, but again, pretty steady and solid on PCI. I don't think you're seeing that going anywhere anytime soon. Again, you can see some of our scores for that as well. Certainly, this is our baseline, right? It's cheating, of course, to put this in the graph. I even debated taking this out, but just to show you just what we use the baseline for, you can just see, again, the collective controls catalog is certainly out there. But as you know, as imagine, right, there's not enough search data on this. This isn't a popular enough standard to really use for trending. So obviously, it's going to score worse in those areas. The reason it scores a little bit higher on an overall grade is frankly because we're involved in addressing the gaps that we're finding. So as we're finding gaps, what we're trying to do is learn from other standards and then fill those gaps with this standard. And so that's part of why it scores a little higher on the criteria. I'm not sure that's completely fair or not. Like I said, I've debated taking this out of the report, but it does technically score a little bit higher, just I think to a large degree because when we identify these gaps, we're trying to fill those and say, hey, let's actually improve it then and include those into the standard. So if I was looking at trending here, again, I know we're going to kind of run out of time here in a second, but let me just give you a couple things I would be thinking about. Standards that are rising. Again, we talked about the ISO standards. The AICPA, even though it's an older standard, is still getting a lot of attention. I think both of those are getting attention because of third-party management. We're trying to find some sort of shortcut that we can follow, and that's one that a lot of people have been looking at. We talked about 800-171, definitely something that would be talked about. The NIS2 standard is definitely sort of getting conversation, although it's very vague and very broad still. In fact, I sort of debated maybe even putting that in the standards in the news category. But I feel like in Europe especially, you're going to see a lot of conversations around NIS2. So I wanted to make sure it was on your radar. It's not detailed enough for me to put in my graphs yet. In fact, it would score very, very poorly if I put it in that standard. I'm frankly probably get an F. Just because there's not enough detail being released. And I think the EU is still in the process of determining those, but I think it needs to be on your radar if it's not already there. And I would continue to say the Australian ACSC Essential 8, again, I think that's just a solid guide. definitely one that I would be paying attention to. If I was building sort of a bare minimum hygiene model, if I was reporting to a board of directors, that might be one that I put some serious investment into. I might look at that one. On the other hand, things that are fading a bit, CDM, I know it still exists. You don't hear about the capabilities there quite as much. Frankly, 853. If you are not a US federal agency, I see almost zero conversation about 853 these days, except people want to map against it, just to almost prove that there's still validity in their program. But basically, if you are a non-federal agency, I very rarely see people talking about it. HIPAA, it is what it is. Again, I think healthcare has sort of their own world on that. We could talk about high trust. I'll sort of save my commentary on that since they're more of a commercial entity. So commercial entities like that, I'm not going to put into our standard. And then COBIT, again, sadly, I kind of wish we'd get more attention on that one from a governance perspective. But even with the 2019 version that came out outside of the ISACA world, I don't see a lot of people talking about COBIT or even COSO really much anymore. But the couple that are in the news a lot that we sort of would definitely want to take some time to talk about here, the new SEC disclosure rules, I know highly targeted, but that would be one that definitely is getting a lot of conversation right now. Along with that, the New York standards, the draft version of the NYDFS standard, both of those are getting a lot of conversations for sure. In fact, I would say, I know I was talking with some folks at SANS, and we're going to do another webcast a little bit later this year, specifically dealing with some of the things about SEC guidelines and some of those things, talking about some of the new requirements that are out. So that'll be something that sort of jumps into our attention here. Of course, CSF, if you've not read the 2.0 draft, you should probably look at it. I know I gave you a little bit of a summary here today, but that would be something that I would be paying attention to, whether you're going to follow it or not. I think the wheel is going to be around forever. I feel like that diagram of categories of safeguards has some real value to it. And I'm even finding myself more and more as I'm mapping and I'm creating reports against the standards using those categories because they really seem to be entrenched in people's thinking for this. So again, you can sort of see those standards overall. Again, just sort of a summary of sort of those comprehensive standards. Again, so you just want to look at that scorecard. That's kind of where we sat this year. Again, a lot of people sort of in that middle range, I felt like this year. Frankly, I think the middle for different reasons though. And I was trying to highlight those a little bit as we went through this presentation so you could see what those were. There is a free sample reporting tool that we released this year with some new features. If you do want to use some of our tools, right now we have these over at auditscripts.com. That's where they still live. This is under our free resources. What we're still finding with organizations when we're doing our assessments, we're still finding organizations using Excel as one of the main reporting tools for this. Don't get me wrong, GRCs are getting popular. Governance risk compliance tools. I'd love to say that more and more people are getting into data analytics platforms for this. I don't know that they are. I think probably if I say, maybe less than 3% of the population has really gone to, let's say, data analytics, configuration management, or CMDB databases for this. Maybe a slightly higher number, maybe 10%, maybe as high as 15%. That's probably a stretch of organizations are using governance risk compliance or GRC tools to report these kinds of things. The vast majority of organizations that are doing assessment work and comparing themselves against standards are definitely using Excel. We can fight it, but it works. Students tell me all the time, couldn't we get something fancier? Sure. And there's some web interfaces that are coming out for this, but people still love Excel. And you can see examples of some of those tools that are out there. If you do need something, jump over to Audit Scripts. We've got some free ones there for you to go ahead and grab. So as far as what comes next for you, definitely, if you don't have an idea where you want to take this, sort of next steps, I would be thinking about a charter for sure. I always tell organizations, think about what the scope of your standards are. It used to be that a lot of organizations would follow just one standard and call it a day. We're not there anymore. Most of you are going to be responsible for 1, 5, 7 standards now. It's not just one at a time. So do you have a charter in place that says, what are those standards? Have you defined that? Do you have a common set of cybersecurity safeguards or controls that you're going to put in place in your organization? And have you assessed yourself against those? If you have assessed yourself against the library of safeguards that you believe are right for you, based on the standards that you've adopted as an organization, then do you have a plan, of course, to fill the gaps that you've identified? Everybody has gaps. Literally, everybody has gaps. So Again, set the scope, decide what safeguards are important, document, define those safeguards. Once you have those in place, make sure you take the time to assess yourself against those safeguards, and then hopefully address the issues, the gaps that you have in place. If you want to learn more about this too, we do have a beta class coming up here. One thing to do this summer was take some of this content. We've got a 2-day class we went ahead and released. We're going to run for the first time in October. I'm very excited about that, basically doing more of the assessment side based on these safeguard libraries. And so kind of continuing some of the things we talked about here. And then we're going to be putting out some more content probably next summer on this concept or this topic as well, if that's something that you want to learn a little bit more about. Again, you've got my contact info here. So if there's questions, I apologize. I know I've gone just a little bit over, so I'll have to save questions, sadly. So if I did not get to your question and didn't address it, do me a favor. Again, I wish I had a little bit more time here today, but go ahead and drop me a note via email, and I'll be more than happy to address those questions as they come up. So thanks again. Appreciate everybody being here for the webcast today. Glad you got to attend. We have a lot more of these webcasts coming up this fall. Please keep an eye on the SANS webcast calendar. There's always events that are going on. We're glad to have you here. I hope to see you at a future SANS webcast.